All right, I want to welcome everyone tonight to our Bud Metheny chapter meeting. We have Jack Bales, who will be speaking with us tonight about William Hulbert. No, not
Lewis
it's
Meacham.
Lewis Meacham,
Yeah, his right-hand man, so to speak.
his right-hand man. So with that, Jack, I will
Okay.
let you go.
Hey, thanks very much, and thanks everybody for being here. Uh, this will be kind of lively and entertaining, I think, and it's got a lot of mystery and intrigue in it, as I said before, and some things were just driving me crazy. They were so difficult to understand. But anyway, excuse me. Now, William Hulbert, president of the Chicago White Stockings, a team now known as the Cubs, of course, was the principal force behind the 1876 founding of the National League. And baseball histories note that he was assisted by his friend Lewis Meacham, a sports reporter for the Chicago Daily Tribune. But besides, and I talked to John Thorne about this, but besides Meacham's articles in the newspaper and in his help promoting the National League, very little is known about the man himself. And in baseball histories, like 4 or 5 baseball histories, he's always referred to as Hulbert's quote unquote mouthpiece. That is, one who supports and presents Hulbert's views. But he was more than just that, though, and I found out that he was widely respected during his journalism career. For instance, when he died unexpectedly at age 32, no fewer than 5 organizations released laudatory resolutions in his honor. But scattered among all these accolades, there were also some critical comments. And a reporter in Meacham's home state of Vermont wrote that he was, quote, a born newspaper writer capable of filling creditably the highest position and was a writer of great clearness and force. But the paper also included this rather cryptic observation about him. But as you will find out, erratic and eccentric may be very well near the mark. And this is what drove me crazy. It's almost like he had a double life. Records show 2 birthplaces and birth dates, 2 burial locations, 2 entries in Find a Grave website, both of which have errors, and even 2 names. His death certificate's all screwed up. He fought in the Civil War, and I've come across 2 military ranks after serving in the Union Army, and even 2 terms of military service. And on top of that, let's throw in some fictitious middle initials and also quite a few embellished facts on his part. Needless to say, Lewis Meacham really got around. But not surprisingly, I was mighty confused when I was confronted with all this mess, but gradually the pieces all started falling into place. And not only do I have answers to all these questions after about a year or so of digging around, but I have theories as to what contributed to some of the more misleading information that's out there. So let's get started here. Here's a basic family tree of Lewis Meacham. His grandfather and his uncle were both named Lewis. So this is where he got his first name. His father, James, married twice. His first wife, Carolyn, died in childbirth, and their son, Elias, lived just 15 months. And his marriage to Mary produced 2 children, Lewis and Emma. Now, the Meacham family tree was a very well-known one in Vermont. James Meacham was born in Rutland, Vermont, was graduated from Middlebury College, and went on to seminary and was ordained as a congregationalist minister. He served as pastor of the New Haven, Vermont Congregational Church until 1846. He was subsequently elected to Congress as a member of the Whig Party and served from 1849 until his death in 1856. His son, Lewis Henry Meacham, our Meacham that I'll be talking about, was born in New Haven, Vermont on March 8, 1846. He attended Phillips Academy Preparatory School in Andover, Massachusetts, where he's a member of the Philomathian Debate Society, and he was on the executive committee of the Mirror, the Society's literary publication. He was at Middlebury College for his freshman year at age 17, staying at Star Hall, room 7. Note that his middle name is listed here, and this is one of the very few times it appeared in print. And this is important, by the way, so keep this in mind, his middle name here, Lewis Henry Meacham. He usually just went by Lewis Meacham. This is one of the very, very few times it ever appeared in print. From 1864 to 1865, he served in the Civil War, which I'll get into later. He was then back in Middlebury for 2 years, and in 1866, he won second prize in a speaking contest. Meacham attended Amherst College in the fall of 1867. He never graduated and is listed in directories as a non-graduate of the class of 1869. He was a member of the Delta Kappa Epsilon social fraternity, just as he was at Middlebury. Now, Meacham began his journalism career in 1869. He was a proofreader in the old Chicago Times newspaper, then went on to the Chicago Tribune, where he was a proofreader and then a reporter. Meacham undoubtedly knew Tribune executive Joseph Medill, and after Medill was elected mayor of Chicago just a few weeks after the Great Chicago Fire of October 1871, Meacham joined his staff for about a year as his private secretary. He inherited quite a bit of money in the fall of 1872, which he unwisely invested in 2 unsuccessful business enterprises. He returned to journalism, and by December 1873, he was the editor of the Rutland newspaper. He also became a member of a newly organized baseball club. He was interested in baseball, but he was also interested in politics. And as I said, his father, James Meacham, served as a congressman. In July 1874, Lewis was elected secretary of a Republican town caucus, and its purpose was to elect delegates for a state congressional convention. He was an up-and-coming politician, it seemed. And in October, local newspapers were praising him as one who had the inside track to be elected Secretary of the Vermont Senate. But just a day after this article appeared, newspapers reported that Meacham had suddenly withdrawn his name as a candidate. 2 months later, he resigned from the Rutland Herald. In the spring of 1875, he returned to Chicago and the Tribune, and now our story begins. And by the summer, he was the paper's baseball reporter, and he soon became the Tribune's sports editor. He received high praise, as you can see here, for he seemed to have a, quote, special aptitude for newspaper work, and he did it unusually well. It wasn't all praise, though. October 1, he thought he'd go from the sidelines to the ball field, and he tried his hand at umpiring. And it was a game between the Chicago White Stockings and the St. Louis Brown Stockings, which Chicago won 13-9. It was his only attempt at umpiring, according to Retro Sheet. And as you can see, it did not go particularly well, what with Meacham's quote-unquote laughable errors. But Meacham had other things to keep him occupied anyway. Tribune articles report that he often talked to William Hulbert and other baseball men to learn about the sport and the new National League. And in 1877, he even asked Chicago Mayor Monroe Heath about the White Stockings leasing part of the Chicago's lakefront for their new ballpark. The mayor said he hadn't thought about it much, but the lakefront park did indeed open in 1878, excuse me. Now, Meacham may have been William Hulbert's so-called mouthpiece, but he certainly did not hesitate to speak his own mind on occasion, and he could be quite critical about how the Chicago players performed on the baseball field and even how Hulbert performed as club president. In mid-1876, September 1876, for example, he complained that the team owner was less than forthright when reporters asked him about the Chicago team, such as which players have been offered contracts for the new year. And note that Meacham even had the nerve to toss in a jab about Hulbert's, quote, well-fed body, unquote. And as I said, the players themselves were also on the receiving end of his rather sharp editorial pen. For example, after one game, Meacham pointed out that, quote, the White Stockings yesterday outbatted their opponents and then lost the game by their wonderful muffing. Meacham was just as direct with other teams. I came across articles illustrating how Meacham and William Hulbert resented how the Philadelphia Athletics and other Eastern teams failed to play out their schedules and did not travel west to play games with Chicago and other teams, which of course ate into the profits of the Western teams. I went through a lot of Hulbert's letters at the Chicago History Museum, which contain assorted references to Meacham and his involvement in the new baseball league. And speaking of the Eastern teams and their behavior, this letter mentions the crookedness of the Hartford team, with Hulbert noting that, quote, I'm sorry to hear this gloomy story, but I have no doubt it is true. Now, Hulbert made a name for himself by keeping baseball fans informed as to what was going on with their favorite teams around the league. He also supplied baseball statistics to Albert Spalding, to a number of publications, including the New York Clipper, a well-known entertainment and sports publication. Now, Chicago and Cincinnati were rivals in baseball, but not to prevent Ohio fans and others from recognizing Meacham's hard work and dedication to baseball. A reporter for the Cincinnati Enquirer, for example, noted that he knew Meacham rather well and appreciated him, quote, as a newspaper man of great ability and a gentleman well worth the meeting, unquote. The reporter added that Meacham was a great deal of assistance to Albert Spalding while working on his baseball guide, particularly in the averages of the non-National League clubs in the book. And he, quote, furnished much of the fund of information that this book contains, unquote. At around this time, Meacham and about 60 other men met to form a group that would eventually be called the Sons of Vermont. He said that it occurred to him and a few others who had moved from Vermont to Chicago that they should all meet informally and socialize. In addition, they sponsored talks, which were followed by lively discussions. So he really enjoyed this group, the Sons of Vermont. Newspapers in 1878 covered more of Meacham's activities. Here he helped he helped an umpire make a decision in a game between Boston and the Indianapolis Blues. They were called homeless because in the fall of that year, the club directors found that the team that was $2,500 in debt, and there was no money to pay the players and none to sign them for the next year. In fact, the team folded that year. The White Stockings were playing the Grays in nearby Providence, which is probably why Meacham happened to be present here. Now, this is interesting, and I never saw this anyplace. I discovered that Meacham was not only a sports reporter, but was an investigative journalist. Meacham had written articles exposing confidence men and swindlers in Chicago, and one of the individuals, a man named Joe Coons, accosted Meacham in a courtroom and struck him across the face with a cowhide. That is a leather whip. The reporter, that is Lewis Meacham, promptly knocked him down, and Meacham, weighing some 230 pounds, tried to sit on him, but instead he tripped and fell. Coons then pulled out a revolver and tried to shoot Meacham, but was stopped by persons in the courtroom, with the judge about 20 feet away, and was taken to jail. I did some checking, and sure enough, the Tribune did indeed feature articles about Coons and his shenanigans, as well as articles about some other persons about whom Meacham would investigate. Now, Coons would purchase articles from items from distributors and not pay for them, and Meacham asked for customer references, which were not at all favorable, and Meacham, our intrepid journalist and detective, had no hesitation and publicizing the man's crooked behavior, which led to Coons accosting him in the courtroom. Okay, now things kind of got turned for the worse. At this point, though, it seemed to be going well for the 32-year-old Lewis Meacham. And as the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper put it, at this point, he was in the very prime of manhood, unquote. He did have some health problems, though, and he would quite often had stomach pains. On Tuesday morning, October 1, 1878, while working on an assignment, he began to feel ill. He went home, felt some sharp pains in his stomach, and the doctor gave him morphine pills and hypodermic injections, which made him feel better for the rest of the day and the morning. Rest of the day and evening, excuse me. At about 10:30 the next morning, he was offered a glass of wine, which he took, but he then fell upon his seat on his room in Dearborn Street in Chicago, and he died. The cause of death was biliary colic. This is an ache in the abdomen, which occurs when a gallstone blocks the bile duct, the tube that drains bile from the gallbladder to the small intestine. This can lead to serious complications such as an infection in the gallbladder or in the bile ducts or in the liver. Meacham, the attending physician, said that his death was accelerated by heart disease. Meacham was survived by his mother and a younger sister, Emma, who died in 1923. We'll get to her later. The flag on the Chicago grounds was lowered to half-staff. His seat in the reporter's stand was decorated in mourning, and the players during the exhibition game on October 2nd wore strips of ribbon, I guess that's bunting, around their right arms to show their respect. As I said earlier, soon after his death, no fewer than 5 groups of people released resolutions in his honor. And the Chicago Baseball Club was one of them, part of which is shown here, signed by Halbert and Spalding. The National League, his newspaper colleagues in Chicago, an organization of Union Civil War veterans, and the Sons of Vermont, his social group of Chicagoans with ties to Vermont. So we had 5 organizations all releasing resolutions praising him. And in 1879, Spalding's Baseball Guide reprinted the National League's resolution. They had 8 pallbearers: William Halbert, Albert Spalding, 3 reporters from Chicago newspapers, the Tribune, the Times, the Inter-Ocean, another reporter named James Maitland, who also wrote Chicago crime books, and 2 persons representing the Sons of Vermont. Okay, now these are where all my problems started coming in here. And this just drove me crazy. Okay, the obituary, I went through, I got all the Chicago obituaries. And in the obituaries, I noticed this: what's with the middle initials of E, B, and S? In fact, I've seen Tribune articles with both E and S. His name was Lewis Henry Meacham. Henry was the name of his maternal uncle. That's a fact, no question about it. And these initials all started with the Chicago obituaries. They were not used before his death, and they continue to this day. In fact, I usually saw just his first and last names. I don't recall ever seeing an H. In fact, it never was H. Let's look at Retro Sheet and Baseball Reference. They both include the middle initial S in the full name, as well as the birth date of March 4th rather than the March 8th. He was born on March 8th. That's a fact. These 2 sources say March 4th. And note the different burial places. One says Middlebury, one says Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. And by the way, I've contacted both these, Retro Sheet and Baseball Reference. I can't remember what SABR person gave me in touch with the proper people, and they said they would fix them, and they were both rather, they were thanked me for notifying them of these errors. In fact, they may be fixed now after I sent them these sources. Okay, I thought the Find a Grave website might shed some light, but as you can see here, it's not Find a Grave, it's Find 2 Graves. Okay, one grave is under Lewis Henry Meacham at the top left here. The correct name and the birth date, Lewis Henry Meacham. Buried at Mount Middlebury, not quite correct there. Bottom left, Lewis B. Meacham. Nope, he was not Lewis B. Incorrect middle initial, incorrect birth date of 1845. Burial at Oakwoods, that was correct. His grave marker in Middlebury includes the correct information. Born in New Haven, March 8th, died in Chicago, Illinois on October 2nd, 1878. I thought Meacham's death certificate might help, but it too had errors. Here's part of it. There's that middle initial of S again. Note the age of 33 rather than the correct age of 32. In fact, the age of 33 also appears on his burial casket, as a brass plate on it bears the inscription, quote, died October 2nd, 1878. Lewis Meacham, aged 33 years. And note here that his place of birth is in Middlebury, which is incorrect. He was born in New Haven, Vermont, not Middlebury. Now, a genealogist friend of mine told me that, she constantly sees variations in middle initials, ages, birthdays, death dates, etc. In fact, she said, what you complaining about, Jack? This happens all the time. She said, quote, many times the variation is a result of someone's wrong interpretation of poor handwriting, maybe that of a census enumerator or a county clerk or even a newspaper reporter. She told me, quote, it's really not unusual at all, unquote. One thing I have indeed verified, though, is his name is Lewis Henry Meacham. And as you can see, obituaries vary as to birth, year, and date, but I found that March 8th, 1846 is in quite a few reliable sources. I then set out to make sense of the rest of this. My first step was to contact the Vermont Genealogy Library at Essex Junction, Vermont. One of the staff members told me that my Meacham project was, quote, very interesting, especially for a few of our researchers who are baseball fanatics, unquote. The lead researcher on my project is a professional genealogist and the current editor of the journal Vermont Genealogy, one of the foremost publications on Vermont genealogy. And he is, as I was told, one of the, quote, foremost experts on Vermont genealogy. So that made me feel pretty good. And the researchers corroborated what my genealogist friend had recently told me, that back then there were no birth certificates and churches were the repositories of birth records. And I was pleased when they told me, quote, you have done much of what we would suggest to do with this problem. So that made me feel good. I'm not totally off base here. And one problem they helped me clear up rather easily. Excuse me. Some sources say that Meacham was born in Middlebury. I mentioned this already. And some say New Haven. The Vermont Library sent me information from this book right here, which confirmed that Reverend Meacham was ordained in 1838 and left the New Haven, Vermont church on September 10th, 1846. He and his family then moved to Middlebury as he had accepted a teaching position at Middlebury College. And by the way, the D here, which means dismissed, is not necessarily a pejorative term. I thought it was. I said, God, look at all these people who got axed here. But I saw records from ministers who moved on to other jobs. They resigned. They became teachers. It just means that they moved on. That's all. And that's just the word that they used was dismissed. It just meant that they left their current place. But if Reverend Meacham had been the pastor in New Haven from 1838 to September 1846, it is highly unlikely that his son was born in Middlebury in March of 1846. The family was simply not living there. The researchers recommended that I contact the New Haven church and ask them about birth records. What I did twice, but I received no replies. Which was okay, they'd have to reply to me. Now, where is Meacham buried? Here's a family memorial in Middlebury. Eva Garstelin Hart, an extremely helpful archivist at the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury, told me that even though Lewis is included on this memorial, he is not listed in the cemetery index. Moreover, she added, quote, there is no guarantee that his body is also there. And she also told me that his maternal aunt Emma is not even in the index, even though they are listed on this memorial. But I found out this is not at all unusual. I kind of thought these are grave markers, but the grave mark memorial could be what a cenotaph, what's called a monument erected in honor of the family. That is, they all don't have to be buried here. So remember that Oakwood Cemetery came up on Retro Sheet or uh, um, Baseball Reference. I can't remember which one. But anyway, I contacted them, the Oakwood Cemetery, and I received this note in reply. I was pleased to verify Meacham's burial, though it had not occurred to me that there might not be a headstone. And here's a map which pinpointed the location, section A3 up at the upper left. This is the old section of the cemetery, I was told. But now here's something. Could he have been moved from Oakwoods to Vermont? SABR member Bob Bailey asked me about this, and John Thorne raised a question to me too when we were talking about it. I'm not sure, but perhaps the note I got from Oakwoods means that Meacham is still there, safe and sound in Chicago. But again, I can't really guarantee. But in any case, I discovered that members of Chicago's Hyde Park Historical Society are studying the cemetery to learn about, quote, the people and events that influenced our community over the decades. So I contacted the society and asked if someone could check out Meacham's grave site for me. And so this one woman named Mallory Price immediately replied to my email, and we had a wonderful correspondence for quite a while, and said she'd be glad to do so. And here's part of her reply. Meacham is buried on lot 208. And here are markers for lots 204 and what appears to be 206 and a half. Unfortunately, his grave marker is not visible. And you can see what she says here. She also sent me this picture, which shows the general area of the cemetery where Meacham is buried. And not too many markers are visible there. She even made a special trip to plot out the only visible markers in that section A3. She said that it appeared that some of the overgrown markers are now being dug out. She hopes that as things get cleared up, maybe the grave numbering system in this whole section would make sense, because she said it makes no sense to her and to others there at the Historical Society. There are no names, just numbers. Let's regroup a little bit. Here's our slide from the beginning, in which I pointed out some of the problems I encountered. Note that we can now fill in some of the blanks. No more 2 birthdays. He was born on March 8th. Nope, no 2 birthplaces. He was born in New Haven, and he was indeed buried in Chicago, and I presume he is still there. There were 2 entries in Find a Grave website. Well, both of them have errors, we found out. Now, this is all wonderful information, but it gets really, really awful right now. And this is what really set me over the edge, okay? There's some mystery about his Civil War years, and I just happened to luck out into some things that helped me. This Amherst directory says that Meacham was a private and was promoted to lieutenant in the Civil War. And that he served for 3 years. Some sources say that he served for 1 year and was mustered out as a corporal. Even worse, I checked military indexes. I could find no official record of his military service at all. Note that dates back there. A year of that date conflicts with his year at Middlebury, so we got some problems here. I could find no official record in military indexes databases, none, nothing under Lewis Meacham. Then I came across this webpage. Meacham was in the 186th New York Infantry Regiment, and on May 30th, 1865, he was transferred to New York 79th Infantry, also known as the Highlanders. He was mustered out as a corporal on July 14th, 1865, but note that he says he, quote, enlisted as Lewis M. Shattuck. Okay, so this helps me out here. After that, it was easy to find information on him, as in the previous source. This document says he left the service as a corporal and not as a lieutenant. None of this junk about serving for 3 years. He served for 1 year. Both he and his company were mustered out. He did not leave the service early due to sickness and health. I found his discharge papers. It notes his day of enlistment and indicates that he was to serve for 3 years, but instead he served less than 1 year, leaving the military with the rank of corporal. And that sums up sums up things rather nicely here. We have his discharge papers right here. Again, I found these in the research center at Middlebury, Vermont, and this Eva Garceland Hart made them readily available to me. In November 1866, Meacham, he was a student at Middlebury College. Okay, at this time, he filled out an application for a $100 Civil War bounty. The United States Equalization Act of 1866 provided this sum to all honorably discharged soldiers who had served for at least 3 years. But remember, he served for 1 year. He served less than 1 year. In other words, he misrepresented his Civil War service so he could apply for this stipend, which I suppose he got. I'm not sure. These Civil War fabrications will crop up over the years in published sources. Just a second here. Let me get something. Okay. Here he admits that he, in fact, by the way, that is his signature right there, by the way. That's his signature right there. Here he admits that he and Shattuck are one and the same persons, that he is 20 years old, which corroborates his birth date of 1846. I have the arrows there pointing these things out. He admits that he left the Army with the rank of corporal. Okay. He is identical. Lewis M. Shattuck was enlisted as a private. Note his rank of corporal there. He enlisted as a private, left as a corporal. Okay, and now, of course, the big question is, again, it drove me crazy, where the heck do we get the name Shattuck? Well, I think I got an answer to all that. See, I went through all of his college catalogs for when Meacham was in school. I discovered that Meacham and one George Shattuck were both freshmen together at Middlebury College. There, and then they were both students at Amherst College. Now here's a record at Middlebury and at Amherst. Now remember that Meacham's Middlebury enrollment was interrupted by a Civil War year of 1864 to 1865. He was then back in Middlebury for 2 years. He and Shattuck undoubtedly knew each other, perhaps both before and after Meacham's year in the military. Meacham did not graduate from Amherst. He was listed in directories as a non-graduate of the class of 1869. He and Shattuck were both students in 1867. Maybe they overlapped a bit depending upon when the semesters or terms started. Here are brief biographies from an Amherst directory. And once again, there's this fabricated service record that I've marked there at the top. The first lieutenant, New York Highlanders, 62 to 65. And it's interesting that his years at Middlebury were not included here. Remember, here is used at Middlebury, 63, 64, 65, 67. They ain't here. Why? Because that would conflict with his fabricated Civil War record. Okay. His fictitious 3 years of service would not chronologically make sense. And over the years, Meacham undoubtedly supplied much of this information to Amherst, excuse me. Incidentally, he was note in the middle of the entry that he was a tutor at the Union Christian College in Merrim, Indiana. He was not a tutor there. He taught mathematics there for 5 weeks in early 1868. The Vermont newspapers at the time reported that he was appointed a full professor. This prompted the president of the college to issue a very vehement public denial which made me wonder if Meacham himself promoted himself to a full professor and passed out all that information to all the Vermont newspapers, because it appeared in a lot of Vermont newspapers. So he promoted himself just like he promoted himself to a lieutenant in the military. George Shattuck, as you can see, was a medical doctor. So I contacted Middlebury, I contacted the cemeteries, I contacted Amherst, and I also contacted Phillips Academy, and I'm so glad I did, because a marvelous librarian there just loved this project, and she got back in touch with me. So many years after Meacham's death, a representative from Phillips Academy had contacted Middlebury College for biographical information for an alumni director. So someone located Meacham's sister, Emma, now Emma Meacham Davis, who in 1910, she was one who died in 1923, she supplied this paragraph. Now, men had to be 18 to enlist, so Meacham was not underage when he signed up. In fact, recruiters often paid no attention to age anyway, especially in 1864, when the Union was desperate for men. In fact, a Civil War historian told me that the recruiters would often write the number 18 on a piece of paper, put it on the floor, and make them stand on it and say, okay, you're over 18, you're old enough to sign up. Note his sister's comments about him being lieutenant in the war. As we know, all this started with Meacham himself. As far as him being taken prisoner at Bull Run, Meacham was indeed a member of the 79th Infantry, which fought at both battles of Bull Run in 1861 and 1862, but Meacham was not a member of the military at that time. He enlisted in 1864. I could not confirm in his service records about him being wounded and captured by the Confederates. That appeared in some obituaries. I could find no proof about it, or having contracted a disease, but he did indeed have stomach problems and stomach pains throughout his life. Now, we may think it's unusual for people to change their names like this, but I found out that during the Civil War, this was not at all unusual. And this, I'm not a Civil War historian, so I did not know this. For instance, some wanted to avoid angry comments from relatives or friends, and so they changed their names for that reason. Some did not want family members to worry about them, so they changed their names for that reason. Now, I was delighted to get this source, and this is the only source I found that mentions Meacham running away to enlist, but it is certainly possible. And here are some feasible reasons for his enlistment. Okay, Lewis came from a prominent family. His father, James, was a member of Congress. James's brother was a Vermont state senator. This was a very well politically connected family. They were perhaps concerned about his welfare, so they could have used their contacts to prevent Meacham from enlisting in Vermont. So his running away to enlist and changing his name seems very plausible. Now, remember how Lewis was in politics but dropped out of the state Senate race. Maybe he was tired of living in his family's very well-connected political shadow. He did not want to follow in his family's footsteps. Maybe he wanted to get rid of the family name, do something on his own where he would not be identified with the family. For that matter, maybe he felt a bit inferior to his very well politically connected family, very famous family, and he felt the need to prove himself and stand out from the rest of the pack. In fact, in light of his Civil War exaggerations, which made him stand out even more, this is a possibility. Here's something else. Let's go back as we wind things down here. Let's go back to this mysterious obituary that mentioned Meacham and his eccentricities. This is from the newspaper that Meacham used to edit, so we'd think it would be all positive. But now in 1872, Meacham inherited this money, as I told you about before. He went into business with his uncle in a brush factory in Burlington, Vermont. It didn't succeed. He went out west to Colorado to raise sheep. What did he know about raising sheep? Nothing. And it failed too. So I keep thinking about this eccentric Lewis Meacham. Okay. He apparently had no head for business. So he came back home, perhaps embarrassed, to work on the local newspaper. And maybe this reporter knew about the failed businesses, and his Civil War embellishments, and he wrote this obituary. Or he could have just had a grudge against Meacham, and this was his way of getting back at him. I tried mightily, very mightily, to find a photograph of him. Could not find one, but here is a photograph of his Middlebury and Amherst friend, George Shattuck. So, winding things down, let's look at this earlier slide, which I mentioned the various inconsistencies I found. As you can see, there are now answers to the rest of these questions. One name with assorted middle initials, well, they're wrong. The middle initials, they just weren't right. One name used in the Civil War was an alias. 2 Civil War ranks, he was a corporal. 2 terms of service in the Civil War, he did indeed serve for just 1 year. Now, one final note. I discussed my research problems with the genealogist at the Vermont Genealogy Library. It was so helpful before. One of them said that in terms of errors on newspaper obituaries, much of the time the mistakes stem from what he called, quote unquote, sloppy reporting. That is the careless work of the persons who wrote the obituaries to begin with. And I shared with them all these mistakes in Mitchum's obituaries, and he said, quote, I have never seen such a variety of errors as in this case. My evaluation is that this is sloppy reporting. Again, winding things down, this is my last slide. I've said many positive things about Lewis Meacham, but his presence in baseball circles notwithstanding, when on the job, I have to admit, he still functioned as Halbert's mouthpiece. Meacham was not one to rock the National League's boat, and the Tribune articles reflect the league's philosophy and policies. And furthermore, he did not hesitate to help Halbert exploit situation to the team owner's advantage. For example, after the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which were just staggering under all these financial problems, temporarily disbanded in June 1877, Halbert sent Meacham to Cincinnati to sign players Jimmy Hallinan and Charlie Jones for Chicago, to sign them for Chicago and to give Albert Spalding the quote full particulars. He even told Nick, what's his name, the secretary of the National League, to kind of keep things quiet, not report all this, which I thought was just sheer nerve on his part. Anyway, that's what he did. And he did sign them, but then they went back to Cincinnati. By the way, I've expanded this talk to a lengthy essay for SABR's bio project. Had great peer reviewers that really went over everything with a very much of a fine-tooth comb. And I gave this link to various people who helped me, and I was very pleased that the people who helped me were just thrilled to be. I cited them in the bio project, and the one young woman from the Phillips Academy, she said, "I can't wait to show my library colleagues and my boss that I got cited in this article." And the woman at the cemetery association in Chicago, she gave the link to all her friends and family. Look, I'm cited in this SABR publication, and she sent it to a professor at the University of Chicago, who now wants to start maybe clearing up the cemetery and maybe get Meacham's grave all cleaned up. And so this Mallory Price said she would love to someday send me a photograph of Meacham's gravestone. And of course, all this started with an email well more than a year ago. Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Let me hit escape here to get out of here, and I will open up to any questions if anybody has any.
Thanks, Jack. The question is, and maybe I missed it at the beginning, what was the impetus for you to start with the research on Lewis Meacham?
Oh, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, I've long been interested in William Halbert, and I did some work on Halbert in 1876. The Chicago club lost its charter, and I did some investigative work as to why it lost its charter, and Hulbert pretty much threw his colleagues, his stockholders, under the bus, and that got me really interested in Hulbert. I found the charter. I found the new charter at the Chicago, Illinois State Library, and I did a talk, a SABR talk on this for the for the Cooperstown conference via Zoom when it was all closed down. And I did an article on it for the baseball journal, Baseball, the McFarland Journal, using lots and lots of pictures of the stockholders' names from the. I got them from the Chicago Chicago Historical Society, and I tracked down all the stockholders' names and exactly how Hulbert got rid of all the stockholders' names, and that led me to Lewis Meacham. And I started digging around for Lewis Meacham because I knew he was his right-hand man. Couldn't find anything. Talked to John Thorne a little bit and read John Thorne's book. I said, well, let me see what I can see about Lewis Meacham, because I like doing work on all this. And by the way, my next project is to do something on William Hulbert for the 19th century SABR committee. I came across a quote from a baseball team owner that said something like turkey for Hulbert and chicken gizzards for the rest of us, because Hulbert had a habit of kind of like trying to get all the best players for himself and letting other teams, kind of get lost in the shuffle, so to speak. But anyway, that's how I got involved with Lewis Meacham. And I really, really enjoyed it because none of this stuff was known. I was really pleased to uncover all this stuff.
And given the fact that he exaggerated parts of his life, do you think he used that same exaggeration as editor?
That's a good question. And I read his columns. I know he and Hulbert were very indignant about the Eastern teams. And I kind of read a lot of his articles. Of course, they weren't signed. In fact, one of my peer reviewers would say, well, how do you know these were by him? I said, well, and I quoted and I cited other baseball history that went into Meacham a little bit, and they acknowledged that the articles weren't signed, but he was their baseball reporters. We can only assume that he wrote the articles, and this was common at that time. In fact, I came across an article on newspapers back in the a book on newspapers in the 19th century, and they all said that most articles were not signed at the time, and I couldn't find really any blatant exaggerations. Though I did find one newspaper reporter and another article and another source, and I think I cited it, that called Meacham kind of a blowhard. So that might have been something. And he was very well respected, though, by his peers, as you can see, mentioned by the 5 organizations. But not everybody liked him. I can see that.
All right. Anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, Jack, did Meacham ever play baseball himself?
Well, he was a member of that baseball team, but I guess he was secretary. I think the item said he was secretary of it. And I do not know if he played for that team back in Vermont, of that amateur team. He certainly did not play for the Chicago team. No, I never saw any record of him playing at all. Well, even a minor league team or any team after he grew up and moved to Chicago. No. And he only tried umpiring once. Karen, you got your hand up there? Can't hear you, Karen.
Found.
Now you got it. Now we hear you.
Okay. When I was working, studying public history, I found that if you had questions from the beginning, you would always go to the family Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's all this stuff going on with all this, did you find one?
I didn't, but I have to admit I didn't look, and I did some desultory work, on Amazon, and Find a Grave really good for listing ancestors and everything. But I did not expand it, or descendants, I should say. And I did not really spend a lot of time on it. There must be some relatives listening. I know I mentioned the Emma Meacham Davis, who died in 23, and I followed a little bit with ancestry and other things, but I did not probably finish it as well as I should. So no, I don't have a family Bible. I was kind of
Okay.
getting done with the project and I finished it. And if there was no gravestone there, I would love to might have kind of maybe put one in there. I asked Ed Hardig, the historian of the Chicago Cubs, and he said, well, SABR mostly is interested in baseball headstones for players, but that'd be kind of cool to have one there for Meacham if there's not one there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
Jack, maybe I missed this. What pushed Meacham in the direction of essentially becoming known for his writing and his interest and his work in the business and the baseball? How did he get interested in baseball?
Well, that's a good question. I know he was a reporter in Vermont, and then he became a reporter and a proofreader in Chicago, and he was a secretary of that baseball organization and back in back in Vermont. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the exact year that was. And that is the only tie I could find to his early years in baseball. Then he became the proofreader. He became the reporter. And undoubtedly when he was reporter, or I shouldn't say undoubtedly, but I suspect that when he was reporter for the Vermont newspaper, he may have covered sports. He became another reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And his next step was to be the sports reporter. Maybe the opening was available at that time. Maybe it was more money. I don't really know. And no one ever said, but he did have that early interest in baseball anyway that I found in Vermont. That's the only record I could find of him having that early interest in baseball. And that's a great question, and I'm sorry I don't have a more detailed answer.
And you said that you've been researching for a year. What was the time frame for the research?
Let's see. I think I started in in early 1923 for sure anyway.
No,
And
Jack, your time.
yeah.
How much time did you spend doing the research?
Oh, for my time, I spent well over a year just in solid research, trying to figure out this stuff. Now, I was retired at the time, so I had a lot of time, but I read up a lot. I went through newspapers.com. I went through I'm a former retired librarian, so we had some databases at my library I went through. I was pretty systematic about it, though. I read baseball histories, and that's what took a lot of time too. There, as you well know, we have some excellent 19th century baseball histories to work with. McFarland's done some. Then again, I have a senior moment. I can't think of the exact titles, but there are some good ones out there. I read as much as I could. And I went to the Chicago History, Chicago Historical Society, it's now called the Chicago History Museum, I think, and tried to read Meacham's, read Halbert's handwriting, and I couldn't find any Meacham letters, but I found some Spalding letters. I found Halbert letters that were very, very, very difficult to read. And I spent, at least 3 or 4 sessions during the course of the summer going in there. So that took a long time because I tried to make sense of, I tried to find the original primary source material, as you can see over here, that would
Right.
help me along here and everything. So I would say probably a year and a half of good work, a solid work before I could do my talk for the 19th century SABR committee. And after that, I wanted to rewrite it all for the SABR Bio project, which I got much encouragement to do. But that took about a good 3 or 4 months right there because the peer reviewers really put me through my paces, which was great. I had some great peer reviewers, and I wrote and rewrote it all to make sense, cited everything that I possibly could. but it really, the Civil War thing was what drove me crazy because I just couldn't find the answer to that.
Right.
And then I went through the Meacham's college catalogs. That took a great deal of time. I went through so much stuff online. I contacted the libraries there. I contacted other historical societies. So I remember one time I started work at about 4 in the morning, and it was almost nonstop until 3 or 4 in the afternoon one time. A friend of mine said, "How come you haven't emailed me?" My woman friend, and said, "I'm sorry, I'm on a roll here. I want to keep. I was on newspapers.com from SABR, and I was on a roll here, getting all this stuff, copying things right and left. I want to get everything I could possibly find, you know." And so I have a great file of things. Much,
Yeah,
much fun.
once you get in the rhythm and you get down the rabbit hole, it's hard to get out.
I know. And I thoroughly enjoyed that rabbit hole once I kind of had an inkling of where this was all going to lead. And I thought my theories were pretty good. And I love the one about Meacham running away to enlist just and again, all this was so serendipitous, purely by chance. I found all this neat stuff by contacting these other people, and they were all so enthusiastic and so gracious and let me print this stuff. The people at the Chicago History Museum let me print some things from my SABR PowerPoint, and it was just so much fun, you know, and I just thoroughly loved it. Got a nice note from John Thorne when it was done. I complimented him on his mention in Smithsonian Magazine a while ago, and he told me he had come across the Bio Project article and really liked it. So, and it all started with that, you know, just kind of well, in fact, it all started at a SABR meeting. Oh gosh, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago when I got to talking about John Thorne, about Lewis Meacham, and years ago, but I just kind of put it on the back burner until these other projects were finished, you know.
Well, we appreciate you returning and speaking to us about this. And I'm looking forward to your next research project. You're always welcome to join us and
Thank
share
you.
with us. It's
Yeah,
always
thank
well
you.
done and interesting.
When I get done with this SABR talk, well, I have a proposal in for the 19th Century Baseball Committee, and if that gets accepted and I do it, I'll let you know, and I can do it again for you guys.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
All right.
It'll be good. I'm talking about how Halbert threw everybody he knew under the bus. You know, I like to take on sacred cows, you see, and try to find. And I got some great stuff already from people that I have not done before. This is all going to be new stuff. Okay, thanks a lot, everybody.
One quick last question.
Yes.
The intensity and the amount of detail that you went into and the amount of research you did and how far deep you went down into the rabbit hole is just amazing to me. It's almost like only someone who has the professional experience that you have as a librarian or someone who is a historian would be able to dig this deeply into it. I don't think my past is in healthcare. There's no way I could have done what you did. And I just have to, I'm in awe of how much detail you went to for this to understand and learn more about this, relatively obscure person in baseball history.
Well, thanks a lot, Red. That's very nice of you to say that. It makes my day. It's going to be encouraging me to pursue all this SABR research with comments like you all have made today. I find it really encouraging. So I thank you guys thank you all for your support and encouragement. It'll helps keep me going. Cause I'm kind of a new person to all this. I'm only about 5 or 6 years now in SABR, maybe more than that. I don't know, but it's all relatively new.
Well, thank you for all your work. It's been been good listening to your 2 presentations to us, and good luck with your next project.
Thanks a lot, you all. Thank you very much.
Jack.
Okay, thank you guys. Have a good evening too.
You too.
Bye.
Good job.